Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, what makes a workplace truly fair? How does our own sense of fairness shape our reactions to decisions, interactions, and how we treat others at work? Fairness isn't just a feel good concept, it's a critical factor in building trust, maintaining engagement, and driving performance. But getting fairness wrong can be costly. When employees perceive unfairness, whether in how decisions are made, how people are treated, or how rewards are distributed, it erodes trusts, undermines morale, and fuels disengagement. So, how can managers, HR, and organizations apply fairness in their work to create a culture where everyone thrives? So, to help us navigate this incredibly emotive subject, we've invited the brilliant Dr. Wilson Wong, strategist, futurist, and data scientist, who's devoted 3 years to exploring this incredibly important subject of fairness at work. Wilson is the Director, Insight and Futures at the brilliantly named Wong on Work. Here he applies futures and research methodologies to support strategic thinking for organizational resilience. Prior to his current role, he was head of insight and futures research at CIPD, and his extensive international experience working with GNDP, Commonwealth Secretariat, ISO, and multilateral negotiations at APAC level as well. His groundbreaking work is underpinned by extensive academic experience. He has a PhD in economic psychology and has three master's degrees. That is a new record for this podcast. Master's degrees in economics and consumer psychology, critical theory, and an MBA as well. He's also an adjunct professor at Hong Kong Baptist University and a visiting professor at Nottingham Business School as well. And the quality of his work and research has been recognised with the President's Medal for contribution to management policy by the British Academy of Management. So, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to speaking with you.
Just tell us a bit about the work you're doing currently then.
A lot of it is kind of advisory, and one of the fun things I did this summer was to look at the future of professions and how professions are likely to be valued or not valued, assessed or not assessed, and how this is a signal to the marketplace. So the client wanted to look at how the technologies that they have currently to define a profession is changing, and how the technologies of learning, the access to knowledge, the use of artificial intelligence all change the definition and scope of what it means to be a profession. So that was one of the projects. Others were looking at things like this, like fairness, and how that it can be justified within a kind of corporate change environment. And I've also been doing some work on the ISO side, looking at an incoming new edition of ISO 30414, which is on human capital reporting. And as you know, the EU regulations for sustainable reporting have already come into law, and part of that is looking at sustainable human capital. So organizations who are looking into measuring sustainable human capital are looking to experts like myself working in this field to both measure, develop, and sustain their human capital across a range of scenarios, so that they and their organizations are more resilient.
What an interesting array of work. I think when we were preparing for this podcast, it's like, where do we start? There's so many things we could talk to you about. And we honed in on fairness. I'd love to know, because when you talk about it, you're quite passionate about fairness and what it really inspires you. Why is it so important?
I think it started because I could see that when organizations draw up their policies, procedures, and when they want to change some of these things, everybody's up in arms going, it's unfair. Even a simple thing like an office move where you're reallocating desk space and car park spaces can be, atomic in its effect. You just go, just
Comic is
chill.
the right word, isn't it?
Yes, you just go, it's not a big deal, whether I get a window or not, but it is a big deal, right? So you find that I wanted something a little bit more analytical. So I worked with Paul Sparrow at Lancaster, and we said, okay, there must be in different disciplines, different ways of looking at justice, equity, fairness. and how these are used to frame different conversations. And where this frame is clear, transparent to both parties, you have a common ground to negotiate. But if the parties are using different frames in the negotiation, they're just talking at cross purposes and you're just wasting each other's time. You both go away frustrated. So there must be a better way of doing this. So hence this piece of work.
That's really helpful. And what's the model or the framework that you kind of use to help organizations understand fairness?
Doing the kind of review of literature in philosophy, economics, sociology, psychology, we developed what we called lenses of fairness, and how people looking through different lenses will see the same issue differently. And the argument that we started out was in HR, because at that time I was a senior researcher hired by CIPD to do OD research. And I said, let's go back to brass tacks. Let's look at how people perceive what is fair. And looking at HR, there were really only, I suppose, one key lens that HR uses for fairness. And for HR, the main thing that they go for is organizational justice, right? And that consists of the right input output. So you have the right procedures. So the procedures have to be, for example, when you draw the procedures for something, they must respect the people involved, the parties. There should be a consistent, transparent set of rules that's applied equally. The facts that you use in running through this process is accurate, and that the parties see this process as legitimate. So there's procedural justice. And then there is distributive justice. So how do you look at the input output dynamics? You know, we are very familiar with performance management. So the more effective you are, the smarter you work, the harder you work, all this matters. And whether or not you tick off your KPIs, right? You know, so those are you're rewarded fairly because you have done what is on your list to do. There are different ways in which distributive justice can play out. So you could say for some things, an organization will say, we'll just give everybody the same. You know, like some years you haven't got much in the bonus pot, you just go, everybody's going to get the equal slice, you know, and not a percentage, but everybody gets 1,000 or whatever, regardless your performance, regardless of how hard you. Or you could redistribute the bonus pot by saying, okay, let's base it on need or deprivation. So you tilt the pot so that the lower, less well-paid staff get a disproportionate percentage. And those are different ways in which you achieve distributive justice. And the last bit of this that HR is concerned about is the issue about interactional justice. So how are employees treated and communicated with? So whether there's a consultation, whether there's a dialogue, and then the transparency and accuracy of the explanations when you make a decision as to how you should process this thing. So this is the world of HR, and this is what they focus on as a profession in determining organizational fairness. But there are many other lenses which can slip them by, and they can suddenly find that people are unhappy about something because they're using a lens outside this organizational justice lens.
Fabulous. And what are the sort of, so those are the lenses, what are the common ones that get missed?
For example, if you think about DEI, so you know, diversity, equity, or equality and inclusion. So there you're looking at several things at the same time. You're looking at one lens, which is about capability. So the capability lens looks at where you've come from and how you have been disadvantaged through things that are beyond your control. So, for example, if you're born in a place where the schools were just rubbish, You didn't have the opportunity to hone your potential. You didn't even have electricity in your school, stuff like that. And that impedes your life experience. It impedes the vocabulary you have for entering the workplace. It impedes the kind of socialization you might need to understand some of the rituals and culture of a workplace. And so capability looks at the distribution of opportunity within society, and you want to see who has access to these valued resources. So when you look at DEI, you may want to look at taking a capability approach by going those who come from a socially disadvantaged background, or they come from a region where they have experienced 90% unemployment for the last 30 years. You give them a kind of leg up. You give them the opportunity to develop their potential, equalize the access to opportunity, right? So that's one way to look at it. Then another lens that may be applied, because we live in a very polarized, quite divisive world at the moment, with social media also enhancing those voices. But not to say that these voices are unfair or unjust or unjustified. You think of feminist discourses, right? That for the last century, you've been fighting for equality of pay, equality of access, and if you look objectively, we should find that women should be equally represented on boards, right? I mean, there should not be any reason in a economically developed country where all children are educated until they're 18. Why we wouldn't see more women sitting on corporate boards? So something else must be in play there. And so the interpretivist lens looks at things like discrimination narratives, what kinds of things are blocking access. So it applies to people who are LGBT plus, it applies to people who are ethnic minority. It also applies in the debate around the kind of colonial narratives, because of course we had a period where a lot of wealth was transferred from the global south to the global northwest, So you can see that in the recent climate change debates, how they're saying you should help us, the South, to decarbonize because you have actually benefited hugely from the Industrial Revolution. You have contributed all this carbon into the atmosphere whilst we are still in an agricultural mode. So we contribute 0.1% to the planet's carbon, but we're paying with all the floods, typhoon, whatever. So the developed world is looking, okay, so what is fair now? Because we've had generations of activity here. And that's another lens, the kind of generational fairness, right? If we rape and pillage all our resources today, destroy and kill off the ocean, is it fair to the next generation who will have fewer opportunities, fewer resources to survive a more hostile world? Is it right that we have all the benefits now and then forget about future generation? So all of these matter in the workplace, but they're not within the scope, I think, or radar of most HR practitioners, simply because that isn't the discipline that we were trained in. It's a little bit outside the discourses that are used to frame the knowledge, the body of knowledge for HR.
Because I guess organizations are full of good intention from the point of view of the practitioner or whatever, and HR must often feel they can't do right for doing wrong in these circumstances, because professionally they're trying to do the right thing, but then you're bringing in a time element as well. So if people's element of fairness, it can build up over time, can't it? So they can keep relating how fairness feels to them and go back years, can't they? So an episode that an HR person is dealing with in the moment is actually part of something that's much bigger for someone else. It's a real dilemma, isn't it?
Yes. And the thing is, you can see that time is relevant, because you find corporates now are being judged for decisions that they took maybe 2 decades ago. and they may have done something in the best possible light at the time, and within the kind of philosophy and ideology of that time. And we have seen that in discrimination cases. We've seen them in cases where they have given undue preference to one side or the other side, given more risk taking to one side over another group. And 20, 30 years later, they go, right, it's time to have this class action case to redress some of these wrongs. Um, and and so organizations not only had to think about what is acceptable today within the organization, but what is acceptable within society today with all the different factions, but also how this is likely to play out in the next decades. Because and that's why part of my work is so much on the future of work, looking and monitoring some of these social trends that are shaping opinions, judgments, laws, and how these are likely to then become the future benchmarks of what is just.
It's fascinating. I was watching one of the talks that you gave on this, and you said that your colleague said, "Don't go there, don't do it, don't go near fitness." So, um, when you start a process of research like that, do you kind of start with a hypothesis and then start to see all the different facts? Like, what is your process for uncovering such a huge area, and did it quickly become much bigger than you anticipated?
I think it started with the recognition that the issue of fairness is very badly handled, not just by HR, but by politicians, by corporate leaders. Just a lot of people don't seem to have a grasp of how to engage with the discussion on what is fair. And what I noticed in terms of psychology was that there were different frames of reference that people were using, and those frames were not always articulated from the outset. And so when you are trying to establish a connection, to find common ground, understanding what those frames of reference and those lenses you might apply from the outset makes a big difference to the discussion. You just think of something like executive pay. And the other reason why this came about was because this was in the wake of the financial crisis. This was done, where banks were bailed out by the state, their debts and losses were capitalized as public sector debt to be borne by the taxpayer. So if you look at the dynamics from a distance, you go, these are profit-making agencies. Under capitalism, if they make a bad call, they should go bust, right? And then a new entity appears, and then the losses are, it's self-regulating. That's what capitalism is supposed to be. You make a good call, you make profit. You make a bad call, you go bust. But instead, what we got was a narrative that banks were too big to fail, and therefore the little person on the street, earning just a few £1,000s, will have to bail out bankers who are earning $250,000 a year on base salary alone, right? And then their bonuses could amount to $1 million a year. So suddenly the whole question about what was fair became really very real, because people had no money in their pockets and they were bailing out bankers, and of course, not all bankers are taking home £1 million. There are a lot of normal people who work in banks who are paid wages just like the rest of us. But for a long time, bankers were a very bad word, because it was just, the gut feel was, it was so unfair. And that also prompted me to go, well, unfair by what metric, by what frame? And I started looking at things like executive pay, for example, right? And how executive pay, after people said, "Ooh, talent is scarce," because of scarce talent, we've got to pay them gazillions, right? Because they happen to be CEOs, and you just go, okay, when is that fair? When they earn 260 multiples of the least paid person in the organization. And you go, okay, the justification for that is what it's called tournament theory. And so, if I go out with my hunting gear and I bring home the hunt, I bring home that great big deer to feed the whole village. I should be rewarded with the best cut of that deer, right? So I am expanding the pie. I am bringing back something you didn't have before. Trouble is, of course, executive pay. The executives are only one part of an ecosystem, right? If they don't have a great marketing team to build a brand, if they don't have connections and networks that I can tap into, leads that I can follow up on, or even the kind of golf membership in the right club so that I meet the right high network individuals to do this business with. All of this is part and parcel of an enabling ecosystem, but we reward the individual.
It's almost like the misattribution of success, isn't it? And a lot of organizations are successful despite the CEO, not because of, and yet the reward goes that way, doesn't it? And reward is one of those real sort of sacred cows in an organization, isn't it? A lot of organizations don't necessarily go there just because it's quite a challenging place to be.
And it's political. It's justified as rational, but when you analyze it using things like tournament theory, then you ask yourself, well, but wasn't he the nephew of Lord Rothschild?
So
And
true.
and you just go, so how much of that is ability and how much of that is just the silver spoon that's rattling around? So it's not so easy to justify. And of course, HR has been justifying executive pay for yonks, right? They've followed the narrative that was created with scarce talent narrative. But by analyzing it, by saying, okay, this is how I've justified it and why, they've actually expanded the pie so that your bonuses come from this expanded pie. But when you have companies that are not doing so well, when the pie is shrinking and they're still getting bonuses, that's when the theory falls apart.
And perception is really important here as well, isn't it? People's perceptions of fairness over the reality.
Yes, and also pain thresholds, because if you look at something like distributive justice, right, which is within the calculus, you just go, do I give everybody the same even though their needs are different? And so what you find is that some people end up with far less resources than they need to survive. So in society, we have children with special educational needs, and we go, no, distributed justice, equal, everybody gets 110 pound state subsidy per child regardless of your need. It's not unfair if you use the equal lens, but if you base it on need, it's incredibly unfair. So you see how very quickly, some of the assertions made by corporations, like, oh, we are equal to everybody's treated the same. And you just go, well, actually, you didn't treat the same. Well, Rothschild's nephew the same way, did you? That's where I started, Garen. So it was trying to understand the phenomenon and recognizing that actually in organizations there was a crying need to be much clearer about how you want to negotiate fairness, and to be very clear about what frame of reference, what lens you were using, and whether or not that lens is acceptable to the parties.
HR professionals kind of, in just the nature of their work, leads to two problems that they're wrestling with almost, isn't it? So their actions may be good for some, but not for others. And some actions which are required by certain duties or rights may still harm some people. So they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. So if we've obviously studied the phenomena, what's the antidote then? What are the sort of the various tools or buttons or levers that an HR team can sort of pull upon to help navigate their way through? And by HR, we also mean OD, because there's a lot of OD practitioners watching this.
For sure. Just looking a little bit more about the OD process, when you're trying to do something called a just transition from one structure to another structure, or one purpose to another purpose, you're going to find that the language of winners and losers will come in. But actually, it's not about winning and losing. You're looking at how you, again, we talked about this before, procedural justice, transparency, whether they're treated with respect. And many organizations have done organizational change well, not because everybody gets what they want, but because it is very clear what is possible And the frames of reference are outlined from the beginning. So you go, if we are looking at the redundancy, this is the frame of reference we're looking at. This is how we're going to calculate it. And this is the pie that we are working towards in order to ensure sustainability for the new entity that we are creating. In terms of the workforce strategy, workforce plan, which it's very interesting because I worked with like MOD on their workforce strategy. And there are in many organizations, there are many sacred cows. There are a lot of things that go, oh, no, we can't touch that. No, we can't break that rule. And you just go, you're just, by not putting it on the table to discuss, you're tying your hands and your feet and possibly your tongue as well in the whole process. And you're dooming the process so that you have more people who are angry with you, more people who feel this is unfair and it's badly run. Put it on the table and go, this is something we need to talk about. And this is the frame of reference we're going to use to discuss it. And that's why the research actually looks at the different lenses that you can begin to apply within these contexts. And you're right. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, because there's never an answer where everybody wins. There's never an answer. And most people understand that. But it makes no sense to tell everybody, you're all going to win somehow, and we're not going to not win. You're not going to lose out, because when you go through times of uncertainty, it's not the winning that is the main thing on people's mind, is whether I'm going to land up in the bottom rung. Somebody's got to be there, but the fear is that you land there. And so if you are fearful, or if the group is fearful of the person in the lowest rung, you cut the pie so the lowest rung, who could be you, is protected to a minimum standard. And that's how you cut the pie. And in the theory, it tells you that the motivation for doing that is because you could end up there. And in society, when we look about the social welfare, the social safety net, if you think of the kinds of things where they talk about people who are not working as scroungers and that kind of thing, it's only spoken by people who could never imagine that they would end up in that position, right? That, through a divorce, you lose your house or whatever, and you suddenly find yourself out in the street, homeless. Nobody imagines that they're going to be in that position. But if you put yourself in that shoe, you probably would cut the resources differently, right?
And
Yeah, go
yeah.
on.
Oh no. And it's such a fascinating field. And this is just one very small slither of your research career today. What was your journey into your role as a futurist and a strategist and a data scientist? Like what led you down this pathway?
Okay, so as a futurist, many years ago, I was the gopher for a workshop run by Shell, because they are, the kind of top scenario planning corporation in the world. They made their reputation when, during the first oil crisis, they had a scenario where they simulated what would happen if the oil price tripled and what kinds of contingencies they would have to build into their system to weather that. And because they were the only oil company with that contingency plan, they jumped from one of the smallest oil companies to one of the top three, within a short period of time. And I think that period, they made, at the time in the 70s, they made like $1 billion based on that contingency plan. So when they were running this workshop, and it was a workshop for the civil servants, so it was just to give them a taste of how scenario planning is done, how you collect data, how you look at trends, and so on, and intelligence. And because I was the person making sure this is happening, making sure that the right people were invited to the workshop, drawing instructions, the usual. I was very junior then, but it was fascinating, and I kind of got bitten by that bug. And over the years, I've assiduously trained in the methodologies of futures work. So there's something like 30 over different methodologies, and many of them require computational data computation. So hand in hand with that, I started working more with data. And then because of my PhD, I had to do a lot more advanced statistics, which is only one slither of the kind of work you would do in futures. And over the years, I've managed to work with like Singapore government Malaysia, to look at their national workforce plan and how they needed to look at not just the talented, but also those who are unskilled. How do you protect citizens when some citizens will always be in the unskilled workforce area? How do you create entry level positions in the economy so that they remain economically active? Because what you don't want is a population that's unemployed, idle, and potentially explosive for social national security. I've worked with quite a few organizations, helping them to use some of these methodologies to look at their talent planning, their critical skills trajectory, when they're trying to change from one business model to another business model, whether or not they are foregoing future opportunity by closing down a particular function and a particular capability, and 5 years later they find that that is the thing that will give them a new golden goose. So thinking that trajectory has taken me both into futures research, futures analysis, focusing on future work. But my kind of interest is how that affects human capital, the flourishing of people in organizations, and how do you ensure that the plans don't inadvertently create a much worse work environment when you do transformation. So you just go, why transform if the work that you create is of poor quality? Why?
And do you feel that talent's so important, it's too important to just be left to HR? Do you feel that it's an organizational issue?
Yes. In short, I think that HR has got limited tools at its disposal. And if you look at the life cycle of an employee coming into an organization, just looking at employees for the moment, the touch points for that employee quite far away from HR. I mean, you have the processes and the procedures which you hope your line managers follow, and you hope that your leaders are modeling the values that they say they espouse, but rarely do. You know, you find that HR doesn't have that many leaders. I mean, when was the last time you saw HR make the leadership accountable for their behavior? You see crisis after crisis, corruption after corruption, so many corporate examples of how the corporate behavior has been so poor, but HR sometimes has stood by those bad behaviors and sometimes have felt powerless to do anything about it. But in theory, they are supposed to be one holding leadership and leadership behaviors to account. You know, you think of the post office, just a UK contemporary example, and the role of HR in that environment. The whole, actually, not just HR, the role of the professionals at the helm, the legal team, the the operations team, the prosecutions team, the HR. None of them, you would say, exhibited the behaviors necessary for protecting human capital.
So how do we shift the dial on that? So we see the same pattern played out in different organizations in different scenarios. Where would you say we start to shift the dial and make that change, make it different?
Okay, here I would say that I have a slight vested interest in that. I love data, evidence, right? So moving organizations to a more evidence-based management practice makes sense. And holding them accountable to the evidence. So you make a professional judgment on the evidence, but if you don't go and collect this data about your people, about your business to make decision, then you're not behaving as a professional manager or leader ought to be. I think that would be a sea change in the kinds of conversations that the professionals will have with each other and with their employees and with their other stakeholders, because you're going, I have limited information. This is what I've got. Based on this frame of reference, this is how I'm going to try to make this fair or just. And this is the strategy we're going to apply to make sure that the cake grows, or that we reduce the number of people eating the cake, so that those decisions are evidence-based. with a view to a particular future that people can buy into. So people who leave the organization go like, yeah, that makes sense. They need to go there, and I don't want to go there. Or they need to go there, but I don't feel I can pull my weight in that direction. So that, I think, covers the OD side, and uses the tools, of fairness, to the best advantage of an organization.
I'm just going to ask you a question. So you say you've got a particular focus on human capital. Is there something within that that's capturing your attention at the moment that you're kind of really interested in currently?
Well, something, I guess, topical would be the issue around flexible workings, in all its guises,
Mm.
right? So one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic was to demonstrate that perhaps maybe 1 in 5 of the working population can have choices about flexible working or working in different places, and that could mean time, place, way you want to work. So many different dimensions to this flexible working. And the crisis now is that we live in a capitalist consumer model. So cities survive on people spending time and money in those cities. And lots of livelihoods depend on this rhythm of spending. We find that cities are now less busy. Uh, I mean, I was in Tokyo, 40 million people, no traffic jams at all. The whole time I was there, Ubering around, it was the most incredible feeling to know that there are 40 million people in the city, and many of them are going to the offices still. They have enough flexibility so that the system just flows. Organizations with their mandates to bring people back into the organization are finding it really tough, because people, even though they're contractually bound to the place, realize that they can be just as productive somewhere else, Bahamas, whatever. So, you find that there needs to be a new contract, a new way of looking what's fair, especially since some of the workforce cannot work flexibly. They have to work a pattern. Your drivers, your security people, people who are doing catering, you know, uh, people who are running nurseries, they can't just go, oh, sorry, your children can be virtually here. It's not going to work. So how is the deal going to be fair for both parties? And it's about being imaginative about what it is that is possible, because what you want from your workforce is productivity, you want creativity, and you want innovation, right? If they deliver this together with oodles of social capital so their relationship is good, what is the deal you place out there to make sure that these things that you need from them are there? So you do need them to come together because you need the social capital. You do need them to come together so that there are creative conversations, problem-solving conversations, and innovation. What you don't want is to bring them into office just to have them on headsets, on calls,
Yeah.
where there is zero positive input to the things that you want as a business, right?
Yeah.
So you have to go back to basics. Is what I'm doing contributing to social capital, contributing to innovation, contributing to productivity, engagement? If they're not, then you're working against yourself, right? And that's where, again, going back to the issue of fairness, you negotiate based on the lenses of fairness. How I'm going to be, I cannot treat everybody equally. That's just not possible because of the dynamics of flexible working. But what is the deal where everybody goes, yeah, I can live with that. And if you get flexible working, maybe I'll get an extra day of leave per year because I have to work 9 to 9 every day or something. And so you create these baselines, but they're based on trust. because you've outlined the difficulty that you're in, and you just go, let's try to find something that works for all of us. And for you, I'm going to use this frame of reference because this works for this group of employees. And for this one, I'm going to use this frame of reference because it makes sense. And at the end, I get what I need to keep my business thriving, and you get some part of the deal, not everything you want, but some part of the deal actually gives you a better quality of work life.
I guess the challenge is that sometimes a manager might perceive that as a hyper personalized workplace, like you're treated that way, you're treated that way. But that's perfectly manageable in today's workplace, and if good discussion takes place. I guess one of the things you're talking about there is the abilities or organizations' ability to have good dialogue and open dialogue and make agreements and keep to them as well.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be hyper individualized. I mean, on a day-to-day level, the line managers do that anyway. But at an organizational level, you will look at particular groups where they have particular work patterns, particular needs, and what their outputs, the desired outputs are. So what is the trade? What is the deal with this group? So I need you to maintain service level 24/7 on site. So how do we work together so that this is maintained, but you also get something because the rest of the group is working in at home, right? So it's, in a way, we are going through a sea change in attitudes towards work as well. And we mustn't forget that work is just one particular dimension to meaning and purpose for individuals. So the catalyst was the pandemic, but it opened up a lot of people's minds as to what really mattered. You know, and certainly it's true in a lot of the kind of Western democratic economies. In Japan, I can see that they have gone back to a more traditional way of working, but that is also by consensus. You know, so it's not that they forced them to go back to the office. They wanted to come back to the office to be counted as part of the organization, to be seen as visibly as pulling their weight within an institution. So there is no one size fits all. It's about building a way forward together. Just like when we talk about, you know, how do you engage your workforce? The worst thing you can do is to issue everybody with a mandate to say you are coming back for 3 days, or else we're going to dock your wages. It is, you know, you may train a puppy that way, but that's not how you would treat your employees in the 21st century.
You've commissioned, you've led, and you've reviewed an enormous amount of research about organizations and human capital. What are some of those myths that exist out there that are just sort of seen as common practice, or that's just the way things are, that the organizations or OD people or HR people might just be getting wrong?
One of the things that I do encounter when I go to conferences is that people say, you know, I'm a really good organization. 100% of my workforce has gone through unconscious bias training. I have to pause and go, I know you mean well, but we've studied the literature for a long, long time. And there is empirical evidence, strong empirical evidence, that unconscious bias training has no effect. Unconscious bias training cannot exist in isolation. It must be part of a whole culture shift within the organization, with behaviors modeled and carrot and stick put in place consistently. So if you think that you can just put everybody through unconscious bias training, you tick that box, and everybody is going to be fine, one, you're deluding yourself, and two, you're doing a disservice to your workforce, because their work life is not going to get better.
How does it come to the point where that lives and people investing so much and they feel that it's done? Where does it break down, do you feel? Because at the core of it was an initial good thought, wasn't there? But it hasn't worked necessarily.
The thing is, I don't think it's not that it hasn't worked, but it doesn't work in isolation. And organizations, when they approach something like discrimination with a tick box mentality, you find that nothing changes, right? And you're surprised that nothing changes. And I'm going, why would you be surprised? If your board is entirely male and your C-suite are all middle-aged men, and you're telling the rest of the organization that you're an equal opportunities organization, right? And that everybody, including the CEO, has gone through unconscious bias training. And I'm going, that's not enough. It was never ever going to be enough. And I think even people who design unconscious training packages see this as part of a journey of change. But most organizations have seen this as the be all and end all of their obligation. And the mythology has grown up around this mythical thing that, if I tick this box, I would have covered myself and things would get better because people are more aware. They may be, but behaviors won't change unless you change the whole cultural environment around it.
A question for you. When you look back at your career so far, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned?
This was something that happened when I was a child, and it was my aunt who in the old days, a camera only had film, right? And it only had so many frames. And she had one snap to take a photograph of my pet dog. And while playing, I saw the camera, took a photograph, and then realized that that was the last shot, right? So there was no dog in the camera reel. And I just said, no, it wasn't me. But it was so obvious because you're playing with the camera, and when you take a photograph, when you develop it, it is so clear that you can see who's playing with it, right? so one, I was terribly bad at this, but two, I just realized it was such hard work to begin to cover your tracks, and that became something that guided my career choices, um, that I wanted to always maintain integrity so I could sleep nights. And I wasn't prepared um, to pad things out. I would call it out as it is. And if you wanted to spin it, that's your choice. But I would call out the data as it is. So whatever I found, I would just go, this is what I found. I don't know whether it's any good, whether it's useful or not, but this is all I can say about it. And in my career, I've been called many things. And the probably the most polite thing that people have said is that I'm a glass half empty person, because I wouldn't spin. I would not spin something that I've found, discovered, or uncovered, or whatever. I just go, well, it is what it is. And I think that has been helpful in the sense that I've stayed true to my promise to myself to maintain my own integrity and never to have a sleepless night of something I said or done. But it's also been career limiting in other ways, and it has been a real cost where I've had to turn down a double promotion because the motivation for that promotion was for me to issue notices of dismissal for half the team because they had a conflict with the director who promoted me, stuff like that. And I took on the job, and then once I realized the agenda, I just go, so my promotion is not because I've proven myself, but because you needed someone to do this hatchet job for you. And I very quickly turned it down. So there have been a considerable times where there have been a cost to that, and even CEOs asking me to do something illegal, and then you just go, I need to think about it, but I need that in writing, right? and then you find that it's never sent to you in writing, but that your performance suddenly goes down several notches, even though you know that what you've done is the right thing, because I said, no, I don't want to go to tribunal on your behalf. Right? It's not worth it. I wouldn't do that for my parents. I wouldn't do that for you. I just wouldn't. So these are the kinds of things that have guided me, and also, of course, I'm very much attracted to the puzzle. If something is interesting, intellectually interesting, that curiosity will take me there. And I haven't planned my career in a really planful way. Is these opportunities where so an organization comes to me and goes, I think we have this problem, but we don't know how to measure, contain, shape it so that we can do an intervention. And I'll go, let me go and dig around. Let me just have a look. And then you finally go like, this is what you look like. And the fairness research was one such exercise where we developed a fairness instrument. Okay, it's a bit long, it's very academic, but it's about 45 minutes. But it allowed me to see the landscape of unfairnesses within the organization. And there is actually an academic paper where we could see that if the unfairness comes from a particular relationship, the outcome could be resignation, leave the organization, exit, or it could be I withhold effort. So the unfairness has got clear organizational consequences, but it's also based on the relationships, the proximity, and the particular part of the organization that you come from. So employees have a relationship with HR, they have a relationship with the line manager, they have a relationship with the senior management. And depending on who makes that decision, who executes the decision, the individual makes different choices. So that survey, which we did, was incredibly powerful because we did a pilot with a government agency, and they could see which bits were uneven and which bits were fine. But when I do go to other organizations, they go, we really don't want to know, because that exposes us to having to have these difficult conversations. And I go, well, if you want to do proper change management, those conversations ought to be had anyway.
You've done a lot of learning and development. You've got your, your 3 masters and your PhD. So what are you doing
currently
to kind of keep your learning going? What does that look like for you?
I just did a certificate in AI governance, and that draws kind of my background as a data person. So it stems from data governance, but it's more than that. It's how do you apply AI loose in a way on the data that you have. So you must have a data governance architecture that is quite robust. So I've done that, and I'm in the process of preparing for an exam for the Non-Executive Directors Association.
You're opening up a world to a lot of people watching this, going, okay, well, I'm developing an understanding of the need to bring some rigor to my work, to challenge my assumptions, to look at data in different ways. Are there any sort of books or podcasts or anything that you would recommend, or they've had a formative impact on your sort of perception or way of thinking?
If you want to stay grounded on lives and working lives, there is a book by Stutz de Cal called Working. And although it was done quite a few years ago, it's a compilation of testimonies of how people work, how they experience work, and how they feel about what they do all day. And every now and again, when I feel as if I'm going into a space that's too conceptual, too hard, too rarefied, I'll pick this up, just read one of the stories, and it brings me down to why I want to do the work I do, and why I need to rewrite the blog I've written, so that it makes sense to people who will make a difference to the workplace. So that's one book. And then there's another, but this is a quite an old classic. It's by Robert Schiller. It's called Irrational Exuberance. I don't know if you've heard of that before. And it is about how um, we are often irrationally optimistic about outcomes. So you find like when we build a project on high-speed rail or something, you just go, oh, we can do it. It'll only take 10 years. It'll only cost 10 billion. It's fine. And then you find that it takes 100 years and it takes 100 billion, and how we make decisions is shaped by that irrational exuberance, because we have and that was my PhD. It was on um, how the psychology of time and timing affects decision making. And because we don't have the discipline to frame our temporal distance properly, we discount the risks in the far distant future. And so we end up making very poor long-term decisions for ourselves, for our organizations, even for our children sometimes. So that's one book that I sometimes go back to, just to remind myself that I'm also just as likely to be irrationally exuberant, notwithstanding the fact that people regularly say I'm a half glass empty sort of person. So um, there's another book called Risk by Dan Gardner, and it gives you a calculus on risk, so that we are not immobilized by it. We understand that some risks you cannot mitigate, they're just part of being alive. It gives you a perspective on risk, which I really find very empowering. So that's another book. And now that we are in this AI bubble thing, the book that I do go back to, and it's a really fine book. It's written by Carl Benedict Frey. It's called The Technology Trap. And there, Frey, who wrote the first paper, the first very influential paper, Frey and Osborne, on jobs that will be destroyed by automation. This is about 10 years ago. So he's written a book where he's reviewed the whole experience of the Industrial Revolution and how it took about 35 years before the good jobs came. So when automation replaced the steam engine replaced horses, and all the people working with horses and carts and their feet and everything. It took 35 years before you needed skilled people on skilled jobs to appear. And it took 2 generations, 70, 75 years, before the benefits trickled down to the working class. So if you take that as a kind of cautionary tale about our transition with AI, when governments talk about just transition, you have to ask yourself, a just transition for whom? Because AI will destroy jobs. They will also create jobs, but there will be a lag. And so what are we going to do during that period when the new jobs haven't arrived, the new skills haven't been formed, the machines are humming away, replacing people in their workplaces? Do we give them a minimum wage? What do we do to ensure that humanity, society survives this transition? Because it will happen. And if we don't manage it well, we will have civil strife, because nobody wants to be permanently at the bottom of the pile.
Final question, because you've actually spent a long time actually thinking about the OD profession as a whole, with all this new technology coming through and just the sheer shift in organizations, what advice would you give to someone considering a career in organization development, or just at the beginning of their career now?
I don't know about you, but I was, I guess, trained in the kind of the classical OD, in the classical OD way. So Edgar Schein, Bjorn, and I still turn to those scholars, because there is something very enduring about human behavior and group behavior, identity and belonging, uh, the want and desire to participate in a group. All of these and the kind of interpersonal dynamics, I don't think those will change enormously as long as organizations want people in their organizations. They don't want like an organization which is run entirely by sensors and robots. So if you have people in the workplace, you will always need organizational design and organizational development specialists to think through what is it that will create the optimal interface between technology and the outcomes that you want. Where is it that there are specific skills and capabilities bring quality to the workplace and to the business, because what you want is to generate real value, not because you're disintermediating cost, but because you genuinely are creating a product or a service that people value, right? And that your workforce and your brand is valued by society. Um, and if that's the case, then you need to begin to think about how you structure, how you organize your people so that they bring that value to market, they bring that value to each other, they understand that there is a real purpose to the existence of this organization, not an organization. And I think that's where you find it's tricky when you work for an organization that goes around buying up companies, disaggregating them, and selling off the asset stripping, right? It's very hard then to go, yeah, I'm generating value, right? But if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I've just developed a new vaccine against something, and the fair thing to do is not to charge over the odds. So let's say you make 100% profit instead of 100,000% profit on the vaccine. You can be proud that that you're slowly eradicating something in the global south that has existed for generations, and you're adding value to society. So without OD, you just have the traditional models, right? The kind of hierarchical command and control. I would like to think that we have so many more tools at our disposal, so many different models to enhance meaning and purpose and value signaling to society that that an OD specialist can bring, because they are the ones that go, don't forget, this is why you're here. This is why you're designing this organization this way to bring and enhance value, both for the worker as well as for society. And I think it's a marvelous profession, because you have a chance then to reflect back to your clients why they're doing this in the first place.
So important. Well, Wilson, I want to say a huge thank you. I'm feeling thoroughly provoked and a lot of things to think about as well. It's been a brilliant conversation, and it's so great to hear that someone with such integrity and skill and know-how and expertise is helping show the way, the moral maze of human capital research as well. So thank you. Danny, for you, what stood out for you from the conversation today?
As always, so many things. It was a fantastic conversation. I think the importance of articulating the framework, the frame of reference we're using when we talk about fairness, and how important it is for people to be transparent and open about that to avoid talking at cross purposes. I love what you said about the importance of evidence-based practice if that's going to shift the dialogue, behaviour and ownership and accountability in organisations. And I've got 3 or 4 books to add to my reading list. So it's always a good podcast when I get some book recommendations. So
yeah, so if people want to follow your work, Wilson, if we want to know a little bit more about what you do and understand the challenge and difference that you can make, so what's the best people to reach out to you and any more information about Wong at Work?
I think because I'm still building the website, so maybe my link to my LinkedIn profile, and to share my email, which is wilson@wongandwork.com if anybody wants a conversation about something that they've heard, seen.
So a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us on this, watching this incredibly interesting podcast today. And a huge thank you to Wilson as well for being so generous with your time and your insights as well. If you enjoyed the podcast, please feel free to hit the like button and subscribe. Wilson joins a brilliant collection of first-class practitioners from across the world. And so if you have a question or anything that Wilson has shared with us today, please put it in the comments below. And please reach out to Wilson on LinkedIn and to follow his blog and to follow his work as well, because it's always incredibly interesting. So thank you so much, Wilson.
Thank you, Garen. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.